Killing Kennedy, The End of Camelot by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard, published in 2012. Book Summary. Part 1, Cheating Death. A Note to Reader's Summary, November 22, 1963. Mineola, New York. Approximately 2 p.m. As a freshman in a religion class at Chaminade High School, young Bill O'Reilly hears an announcement over the loudspeaker about the shooting of President John F. Kennedy. The news is deeply personal for O'Reilly, as his own Irish Catholic family shares the Kennedy name. O'Reilly highlights 7 coincidences, though there are more, between the lives and assassinations of Presidents Lincoln and Kennedy, claiming that these similarities make Killing Kennedy a fitting sequel to Killing Lincoln, 2011, his first book co-written with Martin Dugard. While O'Reilly emphasizes that the book sticks to the facts and that neither he nor Dugard believe in conspiracy theories, he also acknowledges that many aspects remain unknown, and that some supposed facts may be inconsistent. Prologue Summary, January 20, 1961. Washington, D.C. 12:51 p.m. On Inauguration Day, Chief Justice Earl Warren swears in John F. Kennedy as the new President of the United States. Nearby, 3 significant figures in Kennedy's life are present: his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, the new Attorney General, his Vice President and former running mate, Lyndon B. Johnson, and his wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, who is 31 years old. Some of Kennedy's celebrity friends, like singer Frank Sinatra, partied late into the night and skipped the ceremony. Secret Service agents carefully observe the crowd. After taking the oath, Kennedy delivers his inaugural address, which he had refined the night before by comparing it to Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural. His speech quickly becomes an instant classic. The new president faces numerous challenges ahead, including issues with Cuba, Vietnam, civil rights, and the mafia. Meanwhile, in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, Lee Harvey Oswald, a former U.S. Marine who defected to the Soviet Union, lives in obscurity and yearns to return to the United States. Chapter 1 Summary, August 2, 1943. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. 2 a.m. The chapter details the story behind a prized coconut on President Kennedy's desk and reflects on his early leadership experience. During World War II, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy was in charge of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat, when it was struck and split in half by a Japanese destroyer. The surviving crew members gathered on the floating front section of the boat while waiting for Kennedy to come up with a plan. Initially, Kennedy sought suggestions from his crew, but quickly realized that the responsibility was his alone. Drawing on his experience as a former Harvard swim team member, he ordered his men to swim 3 miles to a small island, hoping the Japanese wouldn't spot them. Kennedy then swam alone to another island with the intention of using a recovered lantern to signal other PT boats. However, the strong currents forced him to return to his crew. After 4 days, exhausted and dehydrated, Kennedy and Ensign George Ross swam to the island of Nauru, where they met a group of locals. Kennedy carved a message into a coconut, which the Nauruans delivered to a lieutenant commanding a nearby New Zealand infantry unit. The officer notified the U.S. Navy, which came to rescue Kennedy and his men. The chapter ends in January 1946, with Kennedy running for Congress. His campaign manager, Dave Powers, listens as Kennedy recounts the PT-109 story to a group of Gold Star mothers in Boston. Powers realizes that the PT-109 episode should become a central part of Kennedy's political narrative. Stopwatch equals 800, Chapter 2 Summary, February 1961. The White House. 1 p.m. Each afternoon at 1 o'clock, President Kennedy swims nude in the White House's indoor pool to help ease his chronic back pain. Overall, the Kennedy White House is much less formal compared to the previous administration, though Kennedy adheres to a strict daily routine. Aside from his wife, Jacqueline, and his personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy is typically surrounded by male staff members, leading to frequent humor and banter. This close-knit, male-dominated circle also makes it easier for Kennedy to engage in frequent, casual affairs outside of his marriage. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Kennedy smokes a pack of cigarettes every day, a habit she prefers to keep hidden from the public eye, as she does with much of her private life. Most of her time is spent caring for their young children, 3-year-old Caroline and 3-month-old John Jr., while also planning an ambitious redecorating project for the White House. In Minsk, Lee Harvey Oswald meets and marries a lively and attractive young Russian woman named Marina Prusakova. Chapter 3 Summary, April 17, 1961. Washington, D.C. / Bay of Pigs, Cuba. 9:40 a.m. President Kennedy returns to the White House after a stressful weekend at Glen Ora, the family retreat in Virginia. He has authorized a U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba, led by 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and supported by the CIA. The plan, which predates Kennedy's presidency, causes him unease, and he struggles to get a clear assessment from anyone, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Since Castro's revolution in 1959, Cuba has become a typical communist police state. Under President Eisenhower, the CIA had begun training Cuban exiles in Guatemala, and CIA Director Allen Dulles is obsessed with killing Fidel Castro. Amid the Cold War, Kennedy cannot afford to seem weak on communism, but he also does not want the U.S. to be directly involved in the invasion and dislikes the CIA's plan. Responding to one of Kennedy's concerns, CIA planners changed the landing site to the Bay of Pigs. Still apprehensive, Kennedy approves the invasion but withholds crucial air support. As a result, the mission fails. In search of honesty, Kennedy calls his brother Bobby, who has an ongoing feud with Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. The two men cannot stand each other, and the Bay of Pigs invasion marks the point where Kennedy formally and permanently brings his brother into his inner circle, excluding Johnson. Bobby arrives at the White House to find Kennedy upset over the failing invasion and seeking a solution. The following day, April 18, Kennedy authorizes air support, but the CIA and military botch the operation, and several planes are shot down. In the cabinet room, Bobby scolds CIA officials and military advisors. By April 19, the invasion ends in failure. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger and Jackie Kennedy witness the president crying. Kennedy holds a press conference and takes full responsibility for the failure. Bobby begins attending all foreign policy meetings, effectively becoming the assistant president. Surprisingly, Kennedy's approval ratings increase after the failed invasion. Kennedy sends Vice President Johnson on a fact-finding mission to Vietnam, and the Kennedy brothers realize they are surrounded by enemies. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald is preparing to return to the United States with his new wife. Chapter 4 Summary, February 14, 1962. Washington, D.C. 8 p.m. Jackie Kennedy, the widely admired First Lady, gives a televised tour of the newly renovated White House. Her script for the tour, being recorded for future broadcast, showcases her deep knowledge of the building and its contents. However, Jackie is also aware of her husband's many affairs, including with some of her own friends. This knowledge leads her to often leave the White House on Thursdays to spend weekends at Glen Ora. She feels neglected by the president and seeks the help of a doctor to improve both her self-esteem and her sex life with him. During breaks from recording the tour, Jackie is seen chain-smoking and drinking large amounts of scotch. Chapter 5 Summary, March 24, 1962. Palm Springs, California. 7 p.m. The president spends the evening at the home of entertainer Bing Crosby, after changing his plans at the last minute. Kennedy had originally intended to stay with his longtime friend Frank Sinatra, but with Jackie on a highly publicized international tour, Kennedy sets his sights on Marilyn Monroe, a familiar pattern for him. Some of his more frequent sexual partners even have their own Secret Service code names. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover, the pug-nosed and Machiavellian FBI director, keeps extensive files on everyone, including the president, whom his agency has been tracking since World War II. Before Kennedy's West Coast trip, Hoover alerts Bobby Kennedy about Sinatra's deep ties to organized crime, particularly with mobster Sam Giancana. As a result, Bobby instructs his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, a peripheral member of Sinatra's Rat Pack, to cancel the president's visit with Sinatra, who is furious over the slight. Kennedy then turns his attention to the intelligent yet emotionally fragile Monroe, who spends the next 2 nights with him. At Madison Square Garden, less than 2 months later, Marilyn sings "Happy Birthday" to the president, in the most salacious manner possible, having become so obsessed with him that she calls the White House constantly. Jackie is aware of the affair and is disgusted that her powerful husband would exploit such a vulnerable woman. A few weeks later, on June 13, Lee Harvey Oswald returns to the United States with his wife. Chapter 6 Summary, August 23, 1962. Washington, D.C./Beirut, Lebanon. Midday. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev views President Kennedy as lacking strength, while the Soviets persist in their aggressive Cold War stance, exemplified by actions like the construction of the Berlin Wall. During an international tour, Vice President Johnson visits Beirut, relishing the attention. Abroad, Johnson often acts as though he is the powerful figure he desires to be, making bold and reckless remarks, such as his praise for the oppressive South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. Bobby Kennedy becomes deeply involved in the civil rights movement, especially after the brutal 1955 murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi, an event O'Reilly and Dugard spent considerable time describing. Till, from Chicago, where race relations were less hostile, was murdered after reportedly flirting with a married white woman, Carolyn Bryant. He was then beaten and killed by Bryant's husband, Roy, and his accomplice, Big Millem. Till's mother insisted on an open-casket funeral so the world could witness the atrocity. The shocking photos of Till's disfigured face stirred national outrage. This event marks a turning point for the Kennedy brothers, who start focusing more on civil rights issues, closely tracking the actions of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., whom FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover relentlessly investigates, suspecting him of communist ties. O'Reilly and Dugard note that Bobby is aware of his brother's plan to fire Hoover after winning re-election in 1964. Meanwhile, in Fort Worth, Texas, FBI agent John Fain interrogates Lee Harvey Oswald. Fain is trying to determine if Soviet officials had any demands for Oswald in exchange for his return to the U.S., but Oswald's responses are evasive. Marina Oswald, now in Texas, has become acquainted with members of the Russian expatriate community, including George de Mohrenschildt, who may have CIA connections and knew Jackie Kennedy as a child. Marina regrets marrying Oswald. Chapter 7 Summary, October 16, 1962. The White House. 8:45 a.m. The chapter begins with President Kennedy unwinding in his bedroom, spending time with his children. A knock on the door brings disturbing news: American U-2 spy planes have detected Soviet missile sites and bombers in Cuba. This marks the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a defining moment of the Kennedy presidency. The National Security Team convenes in secrecy, wanting to keep the information from both the public and, more critically, the Soviets. O'Reilly and Dugard highlight that this crisis coincides with an upcoming midterm election, where Kennedy's younger brother, Ted, is running for the Senate. The authors also note that Kennedy has matured significantly since the failed Bay of Pigs operation and is now a much more experienced leader. The Kennedys discuss various military options with the National Security Team, including airstrikes, a naval blockade, and even a full invasion of Cuba. The situation is so precarious that Kennedy waits 4 days before telling Jackie about the crisis. During this time, the First Lady feels a growing closeness with her husband. On October 22, 2 days after confiding in Jackie, Kennedy addresses the nation in a televised speech. He appears resolute and furious, drawing comparisons between the Soviet actions and the aggressive moves of Germany and Japan in the 1930s, vowing that such aggression will not go unanswered. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald becomes increasingly angry at Kennedy's stern message to the Soviets. George de Mohrenschildt has helped Oswald secure a job as a photographic trainee with a company that works with the U.S. Army and provides access to classified U-2 spy plane photos. Nikita Khrushchev, the mastermind behind the Soviet missile deployment in Cuba, responds to Kennedy's speech by accusing the president of escalating tensions. Once a ruthless figure who helped Stalin rise to power, Khrushchev protests the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba. Late on October 24, Kennedy receives Khrushchev's letter, which he interprets as an attempt to back down. Kennedy reaffirms his commitment to the blockade. 2 days later, Kennedy leads the planning for a potential U.S. invasion of Cuba. Khrushchev expects Kennedy to yield, but the president remains steadfast, despite the mounting pressure and the exhaustion of the White House staff. On the evening of October 26, Khrushchev sends a carefully crafted message, which Kennedy's advisors interpret as a sign the Soviet leader may be willing to de-escalate. However, on October 27, Cuban forces shoot down a U-2 spy plane, pushing the situation to the brink of war. At the last minute, Kennedy sends Bobby to meet with Soviet officials, offering to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev agrees, and the crisis is defused. However, the military hawks in Washington are furious with Kennedy for avoiding a full-scale invasion of Cuba. In Dallas, Marina Oswald decides to leave her husband. Part 2, The Curtain Descends. Chapter 8 Summary, January 8, 1963. Washington, D.C. 9:30 p.m. The President and First Lady attend a special event at the National Gallery of Art to view the Mona Lisa, a rare occasion that Jackie organized, even arranging for the iconic painting to be brought to the United States. The Secret Service is present to protect the artwork. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the president and Jackie have never been closer, and their public approval is at an all-time high. While the president has powerful adversaries, Jackie sees the White House as a kind of mythical Camelot, a haven of perfect happiness in a cold, harsh world. On this night, Jackie's presence outshines even the famous painting. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald has returned to Marina, but their relationship continues to be turbulent. Chapter 9 Summary, March 11, 1963. St. Augustine, Florida. 8 p.m. Vice President Lyndon Johnson begins positioning himself as the Democratic Party's leading pro-civil rights candidate, aiming to outmaneuver his rival, Bobby Kennedy, who is dealing with his own set of challenges. 7 months earlier, on August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead from an overdose in her Los Angeles home. Although her death was officially ruled an overdose, rumors circulated that the mafia may have been involved, or that Bobby Kennedy, concerned about the political repercussions of Monroe's obsession with his brother and the potential revelation of their affair, might have played a role. Johnson feels increasingly distant from the political power he desperately desires. Though he doesn't view civil rights as a moral cause, he recognizes the political advantage of gaining support from black voters. Meanwhile, the press starts pressing Bobby Kennedy about his political future, even as he remains deeply unpopular with the CIA. In the meantime, Lee Harvey Oswald buys a rifle and loses his job. Chapter 10 Summary, April 9, 1963. Washington, D.C. Midday. The CIA teams up with American military advisors in Vietnam, assisting in the use of terror tactics against North Vietnamese communists. Although President Kennedy wants to withdraw from Vietnam and harbors distrust towards South Vietnam's harsh leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, he is determined not to let the entire country fall to the communists. In Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald plans to assassinate Major General Ted Walker, a well-known anti-communist figure. Oswald believes his actions will support the communist cause. From an alley near Walker's home, he takes aim with his rifle, shooting at Walker's head from about 40 yards away before fleeing the scene. The next day, Oswald finds out through the news that his shot missed entirely. He then buries the rifle. A few weeks later, Oswald, armed with his pistol, tells Marina he intends to target Richard Nixon, another prominent anti-communist. However, Marina manages to stop him by shoving him into the bathroom and preventing him from leaving. Meanwhile, Jackie Kennedy announces she is pregnant. Chapter 11 Summary, May 3, 1963. Birmingham, Alabama. 1 p.m. The Children's Crusade, a civil rights march organized by Martin Luther King Jr. begins at Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. The marchers are all children and teenagers who have skipped school to march in place of their parents, so the adults won't risk arrest or losing their jobs. The situation in Birmingham has become a standoff between King and Eugene "Bull" Connor, the city's 65-year-old public safety commissioner, a passionate segregationist and racist. King is in Birmingham to challenge the city's segregation laws and the policies of Alabama's new governor, George Wallace. As the children march and sing, "We Shall Overcome," Connor orders the police to spray them with fire hoses and unleash German Shepherd police dogs. Connor watches with glee as the German Shepherds lunge at the children, revealing his deep-seated racism, which surpasses even Governor Wallace's. The images from Birmingham shock President Kennedy and stir outrage across the nation. 5 days later, in the South Vietnamese city of Hue, thousands of Buddhists protest against the oppressive rule of Catholic President Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem's forces open fire on the crowd, killing 9 people, including a woman and 8 children. The violence continues over the next month, and Diem declares martial law in Hue. On June 11, 1963, Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc self-immolates in protest, and an AP photograph of his act horrifies the world. This shocking image convinces Kennedy that the U.S. must find a way to disengage from Diem's regime. Meanwhile, the British public learns that Secretary of War John Profumo had an affair with a woman who also had relations with a Soviet official, leading to his resignation. Kennedy closely follows the scandal, aware that his own personal indiscretions far surpass those of Profumo. Amid these global events, Jackie organizes a surprise birthday party for the president, who now appears happiest when surrounded by his wife and children. Chapter 12 Summary, June 22, 1963. Washington, D.C. Late morning. President Kennedy meets with Martin Luther King Jr. in the White House Rose Garden, where he mentions the scandal involving the British statesman John Profumo and warns King that the FBI has compiled an extensive file on his personal indiscretions, including recordings from surveillance. While Bobby Kennedy has been the main advocate for the president's support of civil rights, President Kennedy himself has publicly denounced segregation and now realizes that his political future is closely linked to King, despite the FBI and other critics attempting to associate the civil rights movement with communism. The president reiterates his warnings to King before leaving for Europe on Air Force One. Back at the White House, Bobby Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon Johnson finish the day's agenda. Surrounded by more than 24 black leaders, the two political rivals vie for dominance as the Democratic Party's champion for civil rights. In a calculated move, Bobby embarrasses Johnson by, "Let everyone know who held the real power in the room." Meanwhile, the Oswalds spend their summer in New Orleans. While Marina struggles with their roach-infested apartment, Lee Harvey reads books, including John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. President Kennedy also enjoys a triumphant visit to Galway, Ireland, the ancestral home of his family. Chapter 13 Summary, August 7, 1963. Osterville, Massachusetts. Morning. Jackie Kennedy goes into labor, and a Secret Service agent quickly rushes her to the hospital. President Kennedy flies to Boston, where doctors have performed a cesarean section to deliver his son, Patrick, who weighs less than 5 pounds and struggles to breathe. As Jackie recovers, doctors advise the president to transfer the newborn to Boston's Children's Hospital, as Patrick's survival chances are slim. Kennedy initially stays at the Ritz-Carlton but soon moves to an empty room in the hospital. Tragically, less than 2 days after his premature birth, Patrick Kennedy passes away. The president is by his son's side, holding his hand as the child dies. Despite his deep grief, Kennedy maintains his composure in front of the hospital staff. Later, in the presence of his close friend Dave Powers, the president breaks down and weeps. Kennedy eventually leaves the hospital and flies to Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod, where Jackie is still recovering. Chapter 14 Summary, August 28, 1963. Washington, D.C. Afternoon. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his iconic, "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial. King begins with thoughtful reflections, but his delivery is more subdued than usual, lacking his usual fiery oratory. Meanwhile, inside the White House, the Kennedy brothers watch the speech on television. Bobby Kennedy, despite his involvement in organizing the March on Washington, does so with some hesitation, given the White House's complex relationship with King. While both John and Bobby support King's stance on civil rights, they don't fully trust him. As King builds to the peak of his speech, his voice becomes powerful, and with the now legendary words, "I have a dream," he inspires an emotional and rapturous response from the 250,000 listeners, making August 28, 1963, a milestone in civil rights history. When King finishes, President Kennedy turns to his brother and says of the civil rights leader, "He's damned good." Less than 3 weeks later, the Ku Klux Klan bombs the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, tragically killing 4 children. Chapter 15 Summary, September 2, 1963. Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Noon. Walter Cronkite of CBS News interviews President Kennedy, asking about the upcoming 1964 presidential election. Kennedy acknowledges the possibility of losing more southern states. He also talks about economic matters, expressing his support for job creation and tax cuts. When discussing Vietnam, Kennedy reveals his reluctance to let Southeast Asia fall to the communists but emphasizes that the South Vietnamese must take responsibility for fighting and winning their own war. He refers to the recent developments in Vietnam as very ominous. Meanwhile, Jackie remains out of the public eye, continuing to grieve privately. Chapter 16 Summary, September 25, 1963. Billings, Montana. Late afternoon. President Kennedy travels to Montana in a deliberate effort to strengthen his political support in the West. However, Texas remains crucial to his chances of re-election, which is why White House Appointments Secretary Kenny O'Donnell has scheduled a fundraising visit to the state for November 21 and 22. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald travels by bus to Mexico City, where he visits the Cuban embassy, hoping to relocate to Fidel Castro's communist regime. Jackie Kennedy begins to emerge from her period of grief and seclusion. She joins her sister for a trip to Greece, where they embark on a 2-week pleasure cruise aboard a luxurious yacht owned by the wealthy and infamous Aristotle Onassis. Free from the pressures of her First Lady duties, Jackie enjoys the time away and even wears a bikini. Chapter 17 Summary, October 6, 1963. Camp David, Maryland. 10:27 a.m. President Kennedy, frustrated, unsuccessfully tries to reach his wife by phone as the press highlights her association with Aristotle Onassis. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, Lee Harvey Oswald provokes the Cuban consul, who assesses him and denies his request to enter Cuba. Upon returning to Dallas, Oswald calls his pregnant wife, Marina, who is staying with a friend, Ruth Payne. George de Morenchild had introduced the Oswalds to Payne, who now helps by providing Oswald with a kindly reference for a job at the Texas School Book Depository. Jackie Kennedy returns to the White House after nearly 4 months away from Washington, D.C. On October 21, journalist Ben Bradley and his wife, Toni, close friends of the Kennedys, join the President and First Lady for dinner. Jackie has been under intense public scrutiny for her trip to Greece. At dinner, she further stirs controversy by defending Onassis in front of her husband. The President has already confided in Bradley that he believes Jackie feels guilty about the trip. Understanding Jackie's strong popularity in the South, Kennedy invites her to join him on a visit to Texas in late November. Eager for her husband's attention, Jackie happily agrees. Part 3, Evil Wins. Chapter 18 Summary, October 24, 1963. Dallas, Texas. Evening. Adlai Stevenson, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, receives harsh treatment from angry protesters in Dallas. One young man spits in the ambassador's face. A middle-aged woman clubs Stevenson over the head with the sign she's carrying. Dallas simmers with rage, fueled by fringe hate groups. Friends and associates advise President Kennedy to avoid the city. In Vietnam, a CIA-sponsored coup topples Ngo Dinh Diem. An officer from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam executes the former president by shooting him in the back of the head. Chapter 19 Summary, November 1, 1963. Irving, Texas. 2:30 p.m. FBI agent James Hosty Jr. arrives at Ruth Payne's home searching for Lee Harvey Oswald. Payne tells him that Oswald works at the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas. Marina, still staying with Payne, initially thinks that the agent might be part of a Soviet-style secret police, but Payne reassures her that everything is fine. Hosty sees no immediate concern regarding Oswald, and the Secret Service also identifies no known threats to the president from anyone in the Dallas area. President Kennedy attends a Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, commenting on the beauty of the place. He tells Congressman Hale Boggs, "I could stay here forever." Chapter 20 Summary, November 13, 1963. The White House. Late evening. Actress Greta Garbo relaxes in the Lincoln bedroom as President Kennedy prepares for a dinner party, following a long day of meetings and events. Garbo is the evening's guest of honor, and Kennedy's childhood friend, Lem Billings, who met Garbo over the summer, had been talking about it non-stop. The president encourages Garbo to play a light-hearted prank on Billings by pretending not to recognize him. Kennedy then gives Garbo a tour of the White House before the slightly tipsy actress announces that she needs to head back to her hotel for the night. O'Reilly and Dugard highlight the moment's significance, calling it, "Thus ends the last dinner party ever held in Camelot." Chapter 21 Summary, November 16, 1963. Dallas, Texas. 1:50 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald practices shooting at a local rifle range. Meanwhile, the Dallas Morning News predicts the possible route for the president's motorcade. 2 days later, Secret Service agents, working with Dallas police, finalize the actual route from Love Field. As one agent observes while driving through downtown Dallas, "Hell, we'd be sitting ducks." Despite the tall buildings, numerous windows, narrow streets, sharp turns, and lack of alternative routes in case of an emergency, the agents finalize the motorcade route just 4 days before the president's arrival. Chapter 22 Summary, November 21, 1963. Aboard Air Force One. 2 p.m. The president goes over intelligence reports while the First Lady practices her Spanish for an upcoming speech in Houston. In the morning, the Kennedys say goodbye to their children, Caroline and John Jr. The president feels anxious, hoping that Jackie will have a positive experience and agree to campaign with him in 1964. At the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald looks over the front page of a newspaper that shows the presidential motorcade route. Though he has never previously shown any hostility toward Kennedy, Oswald now decides to assassinate the president. He asks his co-worker, Wesley Frazier, for a ride to Irving later that day, and Frazier agrees. Oswald plans to plead with Marina to take him back. If not, he feels he will be forced to take drastic action. Chapter 23 Summary, November 22, 1963. Irving, Texas. 6:30 a.m. After spending the night with his wife, Oswald takes off his wedding ring and leaves money on the dresser in their bedroom. He retrieves his rifle from Ruth Payne's garage, wraps it in brown paper, and tells his ride-in to work, Wesley Frazier, that it's just curtain rods. Meanwhile, Kennedy wakes up in his Fort Worth hotel room at 7:30 a.m. and reads newspapers praising the Texas crowd's adoration of the First Lady. At 9 a.m. he delivers a speech to a group of union workers from the back of a pickup truck. Several men ask about the First Lady's whereabouts, eager to see Jackie. The president humorously explains that she's still in the hotel, taking her time to get ready, and jokes that she looks better when she does. The union men laugh heartily. As the president wraps up his speech, one in which he hints that the Cold War is coming to an end, the crowd cheers enthusiastically. Chapter 24 Summary, November 22, 1963. Texas School Book Depository. 9:45 a.m. After a period of rain, the sun emerges in Dallas, and Lee Harvey Oswald has chosen a sixth-floor window as his vantage point to shoot the president. Air Force One lands at Love Field, where Vice President Johnson and his wife, Claudia, greet the Kennedys. The president takes a moment to shake hands with the crowd. The presidential limousine, driven by Bill Greer, is the second car in the motorcade. Kennedy sits in the back behind Texas Governor John Connally, with the First Lady beside him, behind Mrs. Connally. Vice President Johnson, angry and pouting, rides in the fourth car. At 11:55 a.m. the motorcade begins its journey from Love Field to downtown Dallas. Around 12:29 p.m. the motorcade enters Dealey Plaza, where Oswald has his first glimpse of the president. A minute later, Bill Greer turns left onto Elm Street. Chapter 25 Summary, November 22, 1963. Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. 12:14 p.m. Several eyewitnesses see a man standing in a sixth-floor window holding a rifle. One later testifies that he thought the man was a Secret Service agent. Oswald has a bolt-action rifle, which means that he might be able to get off 3 shots in 9 seconds. With the president in his telescopic sight, Oswald fires. He does not even know if the shot hit anything. He chambers another round and fires a second shot, then a third, all of which takes 8.4 seconds. 2 bullets strike the president. One strikes him in the back of the neck, passes through the front of his throat, and into Governor Connally's back. The other people in the limo, including the driver, have only seconds to react and have not yet processed what is happening. The president wears a back brace, which keeps his torso upright as Jackie turns toward him and moves closer to see what's wrong. The third bullet strikes, and the president's head explodes as the bullet exits the front of his skull. Chapter 26 Summary, November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. 12:31 p.m. The aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination unfolds in chaotic and tragic scenes. Jackie Kennedy, in utter shock and horror, cries out, "They've killed my husband," and, in a frantic and desperate move, reaches for the remains of her husband's skull, her hands covered in his blood. Secret Service agent Clint Hill immediately jumps from the following car and rushes to her side, attempting to protect her and secure the scene. His thumb-down signal to the other agents signals a shift in priorities, ensuring the safety of Vice President Johnson, now the acting president. As the motorcade races to Parkland Hospital, confusion reigns. Once the car arrives at the hospital, Jackie refuses to let go of her husband. She clings to him, desperate to keep him close and prevent anyone from seeing him. It's only after Clint Hill's efforts and the urgent need to move forward that she reluctantly lets go, and the president is taken to Trauma Room 1. In the trauma room, Dr. William Kemp Clark delivers the heart-wrenching news to Jackie: her husband is dead. She, already knowing in her heart, does not show visible emotion but quietly processes the loss. As the nation watches in disbelief, Walter Cronkite breaks the news of the president's death to the world. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Vice President Johnson, under Secret Service protection, is ushered into a waiting area, where he is informed that he is now the president. Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, shuts down his business for the weekend. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald, still at large in Dallas, shoots and kills Officer J.D. Tippit before fleeing to the Texas Theater, where he is eventually recognized and arrested. On board Air Force One, Vice President Johnson assumes the presidency. The oath of office is administered to him by a federal judge, with Jackie standing by his side, still in the blood-stained clothes from the tragedy. In Dallas, Oswald, in police custody, protests his innocence, declaring, "I'm just a patsy." However, his fate is sealed when, just 2 days later, Jack Ruby, overcome with anger and grief, shoots Oswald in the stomach in the Dallas Police Department basement. Oswald succumbs to his injuries later at the same hospital where President Kennedy had been declared dead, further underscoring the tragic and chaotic series of events. The nation, and the world, are left in mourning as the loss of President John F. Kennedy reverberates through history, while questions about Oswald's actions and motivations remain unanswered. Chapter 27 Summary, January 14, 1964. Attorney General's Office. Washington, D.C. In the wake of President Kennedy's assassination, Jackie Kennedy becomes a symbol of strength, grace, and resilience under unimaginable circumstances. With her brothers-in-law, Bobby and Teddy, by her side, she films a brief newsreel to express her gratitude to the American people for their love and support during this painful time. Dressed in black, Jackie's composure as she looks into the camera conveys a mixture of sorrow and strength, as she delivers a heartfelt message to the nation that had just lost its leader. In the interview with Life magazine published on December 6, Jackie reflects on her life with President Kennedy, capturing the intimate, personal moments they shared. She recalls, with tenderness, the sound of the Camelot soundtrack playing softly as they both unwound at the end of their day. This memory encapsulates Jackie's desire to preserve the image of her husband's presidency as a time of hope, vitality, and promise, the era of Camelot. It was an image of the White House that, despite the turbulent events that had defined the Kennedy administration, represented an idealized moment in American history, youthful ambition, optimism, and a sense of national purpose. For Jackie, it was important that the world remember her husband and their time in the White House not for its tragic end, but for the vision of idealism, public service, and inspiration that defined the Kennedys' time in office. She wanted to preserve Camelot as a symbol of a brighter, more hopeful America, where dreams and aspirations were realized with vigor and passion. The notion of Camelot, a term popularized by the musical of the same name, became deeply associated with President Kennedy's legacy, thanks in no small part to Jackie's efforts to enshroud his memory in this idealized light. In the afterword of killing Kennedy, O'Reilly and Dugard reflect on the fates of many of the central figures from the story of President Kennedy's assassination. They provide brief, concise descriptions of what happened to them in the years following that fateful day. The bulk of the afterword is devoted to Jackie Kennedy, offering a deeper look into her life after the assassination and the years she spent in the public eye as the widow of a fallen president. Jackie, a widow at just 34, faced immense challenges in the years following her husband's death. She became a symbol of grace and dignity during her time as First Lady and after her husband's assassination. O'Reilly and Dugard detail her journey of mourning, her eventual remarriage to Aristotle Onassis, and her continued involvement in preserving her husband's legacy, including her work at the Kennedy Library and her role as a cultural icon. The afterword also delves into the somber nature of John F. Kennedy's funeral and the profound emotional impact it had on the nation. The funeral was a moment of collective grief, with millions of Americans mourning the loss of their president. The description culminates in the reverent tribute of JFK's burial at Arlington National Cemetery, where the eternal flame was lit, symbolizing the eternal legacy of the men who had been taken too soon. The afterword gives only a short paragraph to most of the other key figures mentioned throughout the book, offering a snapshot of their lives after the assassination. These quick summaries are largely designed to tie up loose ends, giving readers a sense of what became of individuals like Lyndon B. Johnson, Bobby Kennedy, and others in the years after the tragic event. One of the more intriguing entries is the brief mention of George de Mohrenschildt, the Russian expatriate who had ties to the CIA and befriended the Oswalds. O'Reilly recounts his experience outside de Mohrenschildt's daughter's home in 1977 when de Mohrenschildt tragically took his own life. This addition further highlights the mysterious and often shadowy figures involved in the events leading up to the assassination.